We are beginning to learn a Sicha from Chelik Yud Aleph Likkutei Sichos on the different nedavis that was given in the Mishkan, the different donations hinted in 3 times in the first 3 psukim of our parsha. It says 3 times the word Terumah. It says Terumah, V'yicholi Terumah. It says Terumah si, and it says just plain the word Terumah. And the Chazal learn out from that different types of Terumas that, and the Rashi also in Chumash explains that it's talking about different levels of Terumah that we are referring to, different types of donations that was given in the Mishkan. And the Rebbe is going to speak about 2 of the 3. He's going to contrast these 2 to each other and show certain, if you will, opposite concepts and what they are in Avodas Hashem. 1, commenting on the opening verses of this week's Torah reading, our sages state 3 types of offerings, terumas. In other words, it says 3 times the word terumah, which the Chazal say that this hints at 3 different types of offerings are mentioned in this passage. The terumah, the offering for the sockets, the adonim that held the boards, the kroshim of the sanctuary, in other words, the walls that made up the Mishkan, were from the sockets that were placed inside the sockets, and because they were placed inside the sockets, that was like the foundation for the Mishkan. Then there's the terumah of the shkolim, the offering of the shkolim, the coins used to purchase the communal sacrifices, the machzis hashekel, which was given not just then, but annually, was always given the machzis hashekel to be able to donate, and we should have the korbanos that had to be offered in the Beis Hamikdash from the community, like the korban tamid, the musaf korban, etc. And then the terumas, the offerings of the materials with which the Mishkan was constructed. That's what he starts saying. He starts speaking about zav, kesef, and choishes, etc., etc. So even though in the simple sense the pasuk is not talking about 3 different types of terumas, the pasuk is really talking about how the Mishkan was built. Still in all, by using the word terumah 3 times, it comes to teach us, comes to hint at 3 different types of donations. And the Rebbe is going to compare the different donations. As is well known, there's a difference between the terumas hashkolim, the offering of the shkolim, and the offering given for the sockets of the Mishkan as a whole, and the offering that was given for the Mishkan as a whole. In other words, what we gave for the terumah of the korbanos, the machzis hashekel, and the terumah that was given for building the sockets is in one category versus what was given for making the Mishkan. The mitzvah, the commandment to donate the shkolim to purchase the communal sacrifices, the communal korbanos, was incumbent on the Jewish people at that time, and also served as a mitzvahs aseh, a positive command for future generations, that every male of the children of Israel give a half a shekel every year for the communal sacrifices during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, as long as the Beis Hamikdash stood. Moreover, even in the present era, when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing, it is a universal custom, a minhag amongst the Jewish people, to read the Torah portion, to read the passage mentioning the donation of the shkolim in shul and synagogues on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar, as we did in Shabbos Parsh Mishpatim, as a remembrance of the Beis Hamikdash. This is called the Parsha Shkolim that we take out of another Sefer Torah, and we read from Parsh Kisisa, where it speaks specifically about the half a shekel that every Yid had to bring. The reading was instituted at that time because during the era of the Beis Hamikdash, on the 1st of Adar, an announcement was made regarding donating the shkolim, to be able to have them ready so that they should be able to be collected, so that by a month later they would have it enough to be able to, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they would be able to buy the communal offerings from the new shkolim. Furthermore, there are authorities that say that half of the standard coin of the current local currency should be given to tzedakah before Purim as a remembrance of the half shekel that was given in Adar. This is the custom that by Tainus Esther we give a half a shekel to remember the half a shekel that was given in the times of the Beis Hamikdash for the Karbonos Sibur. So we see how there is a constant and consistent obligation of this half a shekel. It wasn't just a one-time event. By contrast, there was an obligation to donate for the sockets, for the Adonim, only before the building of the Mishkan, and the obligation to donate for the Mishkan all the different types of things. The third obligation, the Zav, the Kesav, and the Chayshes as a whole, applied only at that time and before the building of the Beis Hamikdash, just like there was an obligation to give money to be able to make the sockets and to be able to make all the other materials of the Mishkan in the Midbar. So similarly, when it came time to build the Beis Hamikdash, there was also an obligation on Klal Yisrael to do so, but there was no constant and consistent obligation to do so, as it is with the half a shekel that is for the Karbonos Sibur, for the communal offerings. Nevertheless, since the Torah is eternal, applying at all times and in all places, it follows that these two types of donations, those for the sockets, the Adonim, and those for the Mishkan as a whole, the sanctuary as a whole, are relevant to our divine service at present as well. It matters in our Avodas Hashem now as well. The universal relevance of the Torah applies to every particular element and field of Torah study. How much more so does it apply with regard to the details of the Mishkan, the sanctuary, about which it is written, "V'shachanti b'soichem," I will dwell within. A verse on which Chazal commented, the pasuk does not say b'soichoi, the verse does not say within it, but rather b'soicham, within them. Meaning, within every member of the Jewish people, the Shekhinah is Shoyram through the Mishkan. The intent is that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, be revealed and drawn down within the soul of every member of the Jewish people in every place and every time through his or her Avodas Hashem, divine service. So therefore, accordingly, just as the building of the Mishkan in a physical sense was made possible through the Terumahs, the donations described above, so too the spiritual Mishkan, the spiritual sanctuary within every Yid, is brought about through Avodas Hashem, divine service, that is the spiritual parallel of these donations, and therefore it's important to translate and to apply this throughout time. Even when we don't have the physical Mishkan, we still have the spiritual service of the offering of the sockets and the offering of the building of the Mishkan, etc. Section 2. The Avodas Hashem, the divine service corresponding to the donations for the Adonim, and those for the Mishkan as a whole, can be understood by clarifying the manner in which these donations were given in the actual construction of the sanctuary, the Mishkan. All those commanded participated in the donations for the sockets by giving a uniform amount, half a shekel. Just like the Karbonos Sibur, the communal offerings, were a half a shekel, so too the Adonim, the sockets, were also a half a shekel. Now let's contrast it with something else involved in the building of the Mishkan. That's one part of the building. The rest of the building, by contrast, every Jew donated to the construction of the Mishkan, the sanctuary as a whole, according to the generosity of his heart, kifi nidvas liboy, giving as much as he or she desired, as related in Parshas Vayakil. Now, let us to analyze just this concept alone, taking this concept alone about the difference between how the Yidden donated for the Adonim, for the sockets, versus how they donated for the rest of the Mishkan. The parallels in our Avodas Hashem, in our divine service, can be explained as follows. The donation for the sockets corresponds to the bittul and Kabbalah's oil, the acceptance of Hashem's yoke, of God's yoke that stem from the essence of the soul. This idea that a Jew is bottled to Hashem regardless of their intellectual understanding or their emotional appreciation, that is something that is in the essence of the Jew. And because it's the essence, and the essence of every Jew is the same, so all Jews are equal with regard to these obligations, to their essential bittul and acceptance of Hashem's kingship. The donations for the construction of the Mishkan as a whole, the sanctuary as a whole, correspond to a person's avodas Hashem, divine service, with his individual intellectual and emotional faculties. Here we're talking about each person according to their particular talents, emotions, appreciations, intellectual perceptions. In the exercise of these faculties, the intellect and the emotions, there's a wide range of variation depending on each person's spiritual standing. Each person's generosity of heart, nidvas halev, what does that mean? The refinement of his character traits through his labor with his mind and his heart differs from that of another. So therefore, the donations were different. Every person gave according to their particular feelings and emotions, etc., etc. So on this basis can be understood why the donation given uniformly by every Jew, the half shekel, was specifically used for the adonim, the sockets, while the curtains, the yiriyos, and implements, the kelim of the Mishkan of the sanctuary, were made from the donations dependent on every person's individual generosity. Kol ish asher yidvenu liboy. The sockets, the adonim, were the lowest element of the Mishkan, yet simultaneously served as the foundation for its entirety. So on the one hand, it's the lowest, it's literally the lowest part of what was built of the Mishkan, but on the other hand, it's on which the entire Mishkan stands on. It's the foundation. They were the base upon which the boards, meaning the kroshim, and the remainder of the Mishkan, the sanctuary, stood. What does that mean in the service of Hashem? It's like we mentioned before, the parallel to the sockets to the adonim in a person's avodas Hashem divine service is Kabbalah's oil, accepting the yoke of heaven. True, in a revealed manner, godly light is not felt in the service of Kabbalah's oil to the same degree as it is felt through the inner service of the mind and the heart. We do not feel such a revelation of godliness as when we understand God or we have a feeling of Hashem in our heart, when we're just doing it because we have to do it. Yet, on the other hand, however, it is the foundation and starting point for all avodas Hashem. Therefore, all those who donated gave the same amount for the adonim. The implication is that there is no difference between one Jew and another with regard to the fundamental and all-inclusive service of Kabbalah's oil and bittul rooted in the essence of the soul. When looking at the essence of the soul, all Jews are identical and we all share one Father. By contrast, the parallel within a person's soul to the other elements of the Mishkan of the sanctuary, which means you have the karoshim, the boards, the curtains, the yiriyos, and the like, is avodas Hashem, divine service with the individual powers of the soul, like the intellect and the emotions, or even higher than that. For example, the boards, the karoshim, were eser amos. They were 10 cubits high, alluding to the 10 koichim pnimiyim, inner powers of a person's soul, the 3 intellectual powers, the 7 emotional powers, like it's brought down Tanya. The curtains, which were placed as a roof of the sanctuary, allude to the soul's encompassing powers, koiches makifim, often identified with the person's will, the person's delight. Since one person's power of will, thought, and feeling do not resemble those of another, each one has their own unique level, it is understood that there will be a corresponding difference in the manner and level of divine service manifested by each person as befitting the nature of his character. Some people are more intellectually oriented, some people are more emotionally oriented, etc. Accordingly, the nature of the donations made to the Mishkan, to the sanctuary, varied from person to person. So, up till now, the Rebbe established the two types of avodas that are resembled by the two types of donations, the donations of the Adonim, the donations of the half a shekel for the sockets, and the donations for the rest of the Mishkan, which were unique and different by everyone, indicating their emotional, intellectual differences, that everyone is different. Now the Rebbe is going to point out that we still find that there are certain things that of the Adonim's donation that should have been more appropriate for the Mishkan's donations, and certain things of the Mishkan's donations that are more appropriate for the Adonim, based on what we had explained before. Section 3, based on the above, a further point requires clarification. There is yet another difference between the donations for the Adonim, the sockets, and the donations for the Mishkan as a whole. Only the men, not the women, were obligated to give the half shekel for the sockets for the Adonim, and they were so obligated only when they were 20 years old, not younger. By contrast, with regard to the donations for the Mishkan as a whole, all the other parts making up the Mishkan, both men and women gave. Indeed, the verse, "and the men brought with the women," is interpreted to mean that the donations of the men were secondary to those of the women, that the women brought more and greater than the men did. Moreover, even children below the age of bar and bas mitzvah brought donations to the Mishkan, as stated in Avos Rab Nosson. According to the above explanation, it would appear that the opposite approach should have been followed. That by the Adonim, everybody should have been bringing, and by the rest of the Mishkan, it should have been limited to those over 20 years old and only men. Kabbalah, oil, and bittul that stem from the essence of the soul, which are reflected in the donations of the sockets, because they were the basis and they were the lowest, are qualities that relate to every Jewish man and woman, and indeed even to children. So therefore, the donations for the sockets should have been given by all. By contrast, structured avodas Hashem, divine service, involving a person's koiches pnimiyim, inner soul powers, like the intellect and emotions, and koiches makifim, and the transcendent encompassing soul powers, that are paralleled by donations for the Mishkan as a whole. Like we said, there's the boards and there's the yediyos, is primarily related to an adult male, one whose inner powers are fully developed and on a level appropriate for inward avodas Hashem. So how come do we find that doesn't work the opposite way around? Another point requires clarification. There are opinions, there are authorities who explain that the mitzvah, the rich shall not give more, nor shall the poor give less. Ha'oshir lo yarbe, v'ada lo yamit. Even though often it's explained that it's talking about the machzis hashekel given for the karbonis, for the karbonis sibur. So there are those that explain that it refers to the donation of the half shekel given to the sockets, given for the sockets for the Adonim. In spiritual terms, the difference between the rich and poor is reflected by our Chazal statement, the sage's statement. The classification of one as poor is dependent solely on the person's dearth of knowledge. A person ein oni ela badas. A person who is called poor is he's poor in knowledge. So again, we're seeing where a person's capability is all of a sudden taken into the equation. This raises the question. Knowledge is one of a person's koiches pnimiyim, his inner soul powers, which is distinct one from another. Why then does the Torah hint at the distinction between levels of knowledge alluded to by wealth and poverty with regard to the donations made for the sockets, which allude to Kabbalah soul that stems from the essence of the soul? True, the Torah states that a distinction should not be made, even though seemingly all that should be said is that everyone should give a uniform sum, a half a shekel, nothing else. So why mention giving more or less? In other words, even when you are negating something and you are saying, don't give more according to being rich, and don't give less according to being poor, that means that poverty and riches play some type of role, but we're saying despite the role that they play, over here we're going to ignore it. But when we're dealing with the essence of the soul, poverty in mind and riches in mind seemingly play no role in the entire issue. So the Rebbe is going to explain, just to give you a little bit of insight to where we're going to go with this, that each one of these type of things, each one of these types of avodas, the avodah of Kabbalas oil versus the avodah with the koiches pnimim and the koiches makifim, each one is informed by the other. The Kabbalas oil is the basis and needs to permeate the koiches pnimim and koiches makifim. The above questions can be resolved by explaining the order of the Avodas Hashem divine service a person carries out throughout the day. In that way, building and erecting his inner spiritual sanctuary. How does he build his own internal Mishkan and Migdash within him? The V'shachanti b'soicham. Let's look at what the person does throughout his day. A Jew begins his daily Avodas Hashem divine service by reciting at Moedani immediately upon arising from sleep, before washing his hands, even while the spirit of tumma impurity still rests upon them, because Moedani is recited then because it expresses thankful acknowledgement, Kabbalas oil, that stems from the essence of the soul. Like the Rebbe often emphasizes this concept, no tumma, no impurity can reach or affect that level of the essence of the soul. That's why we recite Moedani even before we wash Negel Vasa, even before we wash our hands from impurity in the morning. Consequently, this level relates to and is found within every Jew, man, woman, and child. After starting with this fundamental acknowledgement of the Moedani, a Jew begins his inner Avodas Hashem divine service reciting the Shema and the Shemoneh Esrei. However, preparation is necessary to make it possible to recite these prayers wholeheartedly, so we don't jump straight from Moedani to Kriyas Shema Shemoneh Esrei. There's a certain amount of working our way up to it. Therefore, one first recites Psukei de Zimra, the verses of praise, and the Birchas Kriyas, the blessings before the Shema. After completing his prayers, he proceeds from the house of prayer to the house of study, meaning immersing himself in Torah study. Following that, he carries out his Avodas Hashem throughout the entire day, fulfilling the directive, Hanig Bahem Minag Derech Eretz, conduct yourself according to the way of the world, meaning go out and make a living, etc. The above points reflect approaches that are seemingly contradictory. On the one hand, the obligation to recite the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei is incumbent solely on men and not on women and children. We're talking about an obligation, Minat Torah, and so on. This implies that this is a mode of Avodas Hashem, of divine service, that is relevant primarily to a person's inward powers, intellect, and emotions. And therefore, because we're dealing with the intellect and emotions, there are distinctions. However, all those obligated to recite the Shema and the Shemoneh Esrei, meaning adult males, who are inherently orientated to perform this inward-directed Avodas Hashem divine service, recite those tefillos prayers according to a uniform format. We all say the same words. We're dealing with intellect and emotions and developing our mind, but everybody says the same words of the Siddur. This indicates that this Avodas Hashem divine service, even though it expresses a person's thoughts and feelings, which are individual in nature and unique to every person, distinct from every person, relates to the influence of the essence of the soul, the divine spark shared equally by all Jews. That is why, even though I'm serving Hashem with my intellect, my emotions, and that's why men are obligated in the Krishma and the Shemoneh Esrei, and women not, and the children not, but its uniformity, saying the same nusach, indicates the commonality and the basis of Kabbalas oil, the essence of the soul of every Yid. A parallel to the confluence of seemingly contradictory motifs that operate regarding the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei is also apparent with regard to the study of Torah, the observance of the mitzvahs, and the Avodas Hashem of Bechol Drachecha Da'eyu, knowing Hashem in all your ways, performed throughout the day. However, in these instances, the pattern is reversed, as the Rebbe is going to explain, because each one, what we're going to talk about, informs the other. Take, for example, Torah study. The obligation to study Torah is universal, applying to every Jew, both men and women. For women are obligated to study the laws that apply to them. True, the requirement for them to study these laws does not stem from their obligation to study Torah per se, but is only so that they know how to observe the mitzvahs in which they are obligated. Nevertheless, since they too recite the brachas, the blessings, before Torah study for this reason, that's why they recite those brachas, it is evident that their endeavor is also considered Torah study, or else they wouldn't make a special bracha on studying Torah. If the Torah study is only as a tool to be able to know how to perform the mitzvah, so they're not fulfilling a mitzvah of Torah study, they're fulfilling whatever other mitzvah, and they have to look up the manual of Torah. The fact that they're making a bracha on Torah study, that means that they have a mitzvah of Torah study in regard to their mitzvahs. Furthermore, even with regard to children, there is a mitzvahs asim midaraisa, or mitzvah min haTorah, scriptural mitzvah for a father to teach Torah to his young sons. From all the above, it is apparent that Torah study relates to a level within the soul that is shared universally by every man and woman within the Jewish people. Nevertheless, the nature of that obligation, meaning the quantity and the quality expected of each individual, is not the same for each person. There are some who are obligated to spend their days and nights studying the Torah in depth. There are businessmen who are required to devote less time to this endeavor, and there are those who fulfill their obligation by merely studying one verse, one pasuk in the morning, and one verse, one pasuk in the evening. Similarly, women are obligated to study only A, the laws in which they are obligated, and B, only to the extent that they become familiar with them. Once they are proficient, as long as they remember it, there's no further obligation for them to study. So we see, on the one hand, let's say Torah study is across the board, which shows on the essence of the person that that's equal across Klal Yisrael, and yet, in the practical application, there are different levels of Torah study. Like concepts apply with regards to Avodas Hashem, divine service carried out throughout the day in the observance of mitzvahs, and the Avodas Hashem, divine service of B'chol Derech Ehu, knowing Hashem in all your ways. On the whole, these obligations apply uniformly to all Yidden, all Jews. However, there are several distinctions with regard to the details and the manner in which these obligations apply to each individual. Men are obligated to observe all the positive and negative commandments, mitzvahs aseh, mitzvahs loisa, while women are not obligated to observe mitzvahs shazman grama, time-bound positive commandments. Similarly, there are many different manners and ways in which the Avodas Hashem, divine service of B'chol Derech Ehu, knowing Hashem in all your ways, is carried out by each individual depending on his or her circumstances and occupations. So we see again, it's across the board, and at the same time there are distinctions and there are differences. Accordingly, the distinctions between the donations for the socket and the sanctuary as a whole parallel the distinctions between the Avodas Hashem, the divine service of the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei, and the Avodas Hashem, divine service of Limud HaTorah, Torah study, and the other dimensions of divine service carried out throughout the day. The donations for the sockets, for the Adonim, correspond to the Avodas Hashem of reciting the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei. Women and children are exempt from that obligation, but the men who are obligated must recite those prayers following a standard text. So we see this in the donations for the Adonim, both sides of this. This parallels the obligation to donate for the socket, which was incumbent only on adult males from age 20 onward, which shows this idea of only a certain developed level of service. Yet all those who were obligated gave a uniform sum, a half shekel, like the uniform nusach of davening. The donations for the Mishkan as a whole resembled the Avodas Hashem of Torah study and the other dimensions of Avodas Hashem carried out throughout the day, in which women and children are also obligated. However, Just as every person donated according to the feelings of his heart, like we said before, these services of Torah study and the rest of the day are dependent on every person's individual nature, and the degree to which and the manner in which one performs, one person will carry out these services differs from the way another will. So the question is why? All we showed is we showed a parallel, but we didn't explain yet how come, why does it work that way? In other words, we wanted to understand how that was by the Adonim and the rest of the Mishkan. Then we explained we find the same thing in the Avodas Hashem of a person throughout the day. Now we have to explain the reasoning for it throughout the day, and then we'll understand it. And that's why the same thing was reflected in the building of the Mishkan and the Adonim. Section 4. To explain all the above points, the Avodas Hashem, the divine service of the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei, is carried out via the inner powers of intellect and emotions, like we mentioned before. Nevertheless, this service follows and is developed on the basis of the preparatory step of reciting Moedani. That represents the thankful acknowledgement and bittul stemming from the essence of the soul. Like we mentioned, the Moedani of a Jew is an expression of the essence of the soul, and therefore you can say it even before he even washes his hands or removes any impurity. Therefore, this bittul and acknowledgement are felt within and accordingly influence the Avodas Hashem, the divine service of the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei. His Moedani impacts and informs his later Avodah, making it evident that the foundation of this inner Avodas Hashem divine service is the bittul and Kabbalah's oil that stem from the essence of the soul. So even though his Shema and Shemoneh Esrei is about his intellect and his emotions and all of his appreciation, etc., that he has, but it's founded on the Moedani, and the Moedani permeates even those emotions and even the Krishma and Shemoneh Esrei and so on. The reason that this divine service, this Avodas Hashem, is only incumbent on adult males is that their koiches pnimiyim are fully developed and thus oriented to carry out this service. Nevertheless, the bittul and Kabbalah's oil that stem from the essence of the soul, a level where all souls are identical, like we mentioned before, that when it comes to the bittul and Kabbalah's oil, this is something that we all have in common, every single Jew, from man, woman to child, are felt within their koiches pnimiyim. Therefore, the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei follow a uniform text, the same nusach. Everybody says the same words in davening. Everyone using the same words, thus indicating that the foundation of the service is shared by all. For this reason, in the mitzvah to donate for the sockets, for the Adonim, which alludes to the divine service Avodas Hashem of the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei, the Torah emphasizes the Ha'osher lo yarbe v'adal lo yamit. The rich shall not give more, nor shall the poor give less. The spiritual parallel is Avodas Hashem with the powers of intellect and emotions, faculties where there's a difference between the rich and the poor. That's why you got to tell us about rich and poor, because when you're dealing with Shema and Shemoneh Esrei, rich and poor, intellect and emotions, these play a role. One person's divine service, Avodas Hashem, is not the same as another's. Therefore, when looking at each person's donations for the Adonim, or his Avodas Hashem in the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei individually, before we look at the big picture, when we're just focused on that one particular person, it is not evident that this individual Avodas Hashem stems from the essence of the soul. On the contrary, what is apparent is the 10 Geira. We say that he gives a half a shekel, but the Torah is not just happy with saying to give a half a shekel. The Torah defines what is a half a shekel. It's made up of 10 Geira coins. Why does it say 10 Geira? So Chassidus explains that alludes to the 10 inner powers that comprise a person's individual intellectual and emotional faculties. So when a person is just standing alone in their own avodah of Shema and Shemoneh Esrei, what seems to be primary and what seems to be at the core is not the bittul, but what seems to be is the intellect and the emotions, that everyone is different. Nevertheless, when comparing and combining the donations made by all those who contributed, meaning when focusing on the foundation of their avodas Hashem that unifies them and joins them together as a whole, their donations are uniform. We compare Chaim, Shimon, Yankel, they're all giving the same half a shekel. You just look at this person alone, you don't know if he's giving more or less or the same. You compare them, all of a sudden you see, wow, everybody's doing the same thing. Or you look not just at this person's davening, but you look at that person's davening, that person, they're all saying the same words. The rationales explained above is that our avodas Hashem, the divine service with our koiches pnimiyim, must be carried out in a manner that enables the bittul stemming from the essence of the soul to be felt within it. Accordingly, ha'osher lo yarbe, the rich cannot give more, v'adal lo yamit, nor shall the poor give less. Section 5. Nevertheless, the divine service avodas Hashem of reciting the Shema and the Shemoneh Esrei, which is the spiritual parallel of the Terumas ha'adonim, the donations for the sockets, represents a person's personal effort of refinement within the inner self, achieved with his inner soul powers, koiches pnimiyim. Such an avodas Hashem, such divine service is limited, for a human being's efforts and powers are inherently limited. As a result, the Oyer Eliki, the divine light it draws down, is also conveyed in a limited manner. Chassidus always speaks about that according to the effort, according to what we do, that is the result of what comes out. So if we are serving Hashem based on our limited soul powers, so what it draws down is also a limited divine light and energy is what's drawn down. This explains why the recitation of the Shema and the Shemoneh Esrei is structured according to a fixed text, like we mentioned before, with a specific number of passages, blessings, brachas, words, and letters, and is governed by detailed laws of pronunciation. This structure reflects an ordered pattern as characteristic of avodas Hashem with one's koiches pnimiyim. The very words Shema Yisrael reflect understanding and comprehension, meditation on the greatness of Hashem. Shema does not just mean hear or listen. Shema means from the word understand. So we are enjoined to understand about Hashem. And this in turn, when we understand about Hashem, it leads to the next few lines further. Leads to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. You shall love Hashem your Lord. The person's heart being aroused with the love and fear of Hashem. Through this avodas Hashem, divine service with his mind and heart, he binds his wisdom with Hashem's wisdom, and his love with the divine light, with the godly light, with Hashem's light that shines in the sphere of Chesed, meaning aligning the powers of his soul, his koiches hanefesh, with the godliness that encloses and contracts itself within these attributes. He is connecting to Hashem the way Hashem reveals himself in a limited form. He's connected his mind with the way Hashem limited himself within intellect. He's connecting his heart with Hashem the way he limited and constricted himself. He was mitzamtzim himself in the sphere of Chesed, for example. From the person's perspective, this avodas Hashem divine service relates to specific attributes within his soul. So since it's dealing with specifics within him, so similarly, what he connects to with Hashem is also to specifics. Accordingly, it only draws down divine light, Hashem's light, that shines within specific spheres, meaning a limited and specific type of revelation. It does not draw down God's essence because it doesn't reflect and it does not come out of the avodah of a Jew's own essence. He says in 6, after the avodas Hashem of the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei, a person proceeds to the avodas Hashem divine service of studying the Torah and fulfilling its mitzvahs, and afterwards to the avodas Hashem divine service he carries out throughout the day, b'chol drachecha do'eyu, knowing Hashem in all your ways. The purpose of all of these services is to establish a home for Hashem in this lowly realm, a dir le'izbarach tachtonim, drawing Hashem's essence into this material plane as it exists within its own context. In other words, the world, as it is world, should be able to take in Hashem in his very essence. The divine service, the avodas Hashem, a person carries out throughout the entire day, the primary time in which the home for Hashem is established, the dwelling, the dir b'tachtonim is established, has no limits. There are no restrictions regarding the way he chooses to make a home for Hashem, a dwelling for Hashem in the lower realms of dir leisbar tachtonim. The type of business or field work he chooses is left to his individual preferences. The reason is that the purpose of this type of avodas Hashem is to make the lowest elements of existence a home for Hashem as they exist within their own context, by using them for the sake of heaven, l'shem shemaim, and a higher level, to know Hashem in all your ways. Meaning, we are dealing with the world on the world's level, and therefore there's no restrictions and no limitations of how we're going to bring Hashem into the world. We choose our way of manifesting Hashem in the world. As such, it is understood that the performance of such service is not limited to men specifically, but it is appropriate for every Jew because it involves serving Hashem through action, which is equal across the board. Nevertheless, for Hashem's home, for Hashem's dira to be complete, it is necessary that all Jews also contribute their feelings of generosity, nidvas halev, meaning that the avodas Hashem, divine service of every Jew, be performed with vitality and spirited feelings. So even though the main thing is about the world, but still in all, we should bring our emotions and our feelings into it as well. So he says in 7, the Mishkan was fashioned, the sanctuary was fashioned from the 13 or 15 material entities donated for fashioning the Mishkan as a whole. If we count in the parsha, we see different things enumerated, different Mamor Chazal. They either number it as 13 or number it as 15 because there's different ways of counting what exactly is part of the number system over there. The spiritual parallel to these donations is the avodas Hashem, divine service every Jew performs by carrying out his material affairs according to Torah. Just like the Mishkan was made from material things all around us. And in that way, drawing down Hashem's essence, not the way he's constricted in davening in those particular spheres, into this lowly material world. Nevertheless, this avodas Hashem is only possible after one carries out the spiritual parallel to the donations for the sockets brought by those over the age of 20. It is specifically the avodas Hashem, the divine service with one's koiches pnimim, based on the bittul and kabbalas oil stemming from the essence of the soul, that empowers every person to draw Hashem's essence into this lowly realm by carrying out the avodas Hashem that parallels the donations for the Mishkan as a whole. So everything was built on top of the other. You have the Moida Ani, which informs the Shema and the Shemoneh Esrei, and the Shema and the Shemoneh Esrei impacts and informs how we're going to bring this about into the world, that we're going to be able to bring down Hashem's essence into the world. This follows the pattern of the divine service that the Jews as a people carry out to make a sanctuary, to make the Jewish people carry out day after day, specifically after recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei by Jewish adults. Every Jew has the potential to do his or her part in working to establish a dwelling, a home for Hashem over the course of the day, as explained above. 8. The foundation for the preparatory stage for the daily pattern a person follows to make a Mishkan v'shachanti b'soicham for Hashem in his or own life is the recitation of Moidani. With that statement, one gives voice to the bittul and kabbalas oil that stem from the essence of the soul. A similar pattern applied in the construction of the Mishkan. Before Moshe conveyed Hashem's command to build the Mishkan to the Jewish people, he gathered together the entire congregation of the children of Israel. Vayakil Moshe is called as Bnei Yisrael, the beginning of parts of Vayakil. Seemingly, he should have first gathered all the men of 20 and older and commanded them to bring the Trumas HaAdonim, the donations for the sockets, for these comprise the first element of the Mishkan, its base. And afterwards he should have gathered the entire people, including the women, and commanded them to bring the donations for the Mishkan as a whole. However, Moshe first gathered all the people together in order to arouse in them, to arouse the essence of the soul that is found equally in every Jew. Therefore, Moshe was Vayakil, as Kol Adas B'nai Yisrael, gathered together the entire congregation of the children of Israel, including the women and the children, to arouse the essence of the soul presence in every Jew. This is like the Moed Ani that precedes the entire day. This made it possible for him to command them later to build the Mishkan, the sanctuary. This led to the revelation of the motif described above, that the Avodas Hashem of the Koiches Pnimim should be affected by the bittul and kabbalah soil that stems from the essence of the soul. The influence of this bittul on the Koiches Pnimim was represented by the Trumas HaAdonim, the donations for the sockets. This inward service was followed by the Avodas Hashem, divine service, reflected in the donations for the Mishkan, the sanctuary as a whole. A similar pattern applies in every generation. Moshe, meaning the extension of Moshe in every generation, the leader of every generation, as represented by the leaders of the Jewish people who serve as the heads of the Jewish people in that generation, arouses the essence of their soul. So it wasn't just Moshe Rabbeinu in the wilderness, it's every leader in every generation does this. This empowers every Jew to carry out his divine service with his koiches pnimim as expressed through the recitation of the Shema and Shemoneh Esrei. That divine service, Avodas Hashem, enables him to proceed to the study of Torah, the observance of its mitzvahs, and to his endeavors to know Hashem in all your ways, thus establishing a dwelling for Hashem in this lowly realm, Las es lo yisbarach dira b'tachtoinim.